Welcome to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we are finalizing kind of our 5-part series on intuition. We talked about in the first part what intuition is. We compared the two types of intuition, introverted intuition and extroverted intuition. We talked about intuitives that are blenders, people who are blending and not letting their intuition come out. And then in the last episode, we talked about finding intuition mentors, people who can mentor you in your intuition. And today, we want to kind of tie it all together, give some ideas on some next steps for you, and really give you, kind of a direction of where to go from here.
Yeah, and we've been teaching the program Intuitive Awakening. We've been teaching that program since about 2010. And so we're not strangers to talking about this, but this is the first time we've really talked about it on a podcast, right? Because we're relatively new to the podcast world. I mean, we've only been doing this for a little while, and this is the first time we've really done a series on intuition. And the feedback has been kind of crazy. Our podcast numbers just went through the roof. People have been emailing in and asking questions and commenting on the blog posts, and it's been kind of crazy. And what that told me was that this is a need. Like, people who identify with being intuitive, they've got needs going unmet, including feeling misunderstood, getting intuitive conversation. There's a lot of needs going unmet. So while we're finishing up this particular series, I think it's been illustrated to us that we need to be addressing this topic on a fairly regular basis. So this is not the last time we'll be talking about intuition in a podcast. We're going to make sure that we reference it fairly regularly, talk about exercises that are good for intuitives in the future. So if you're a podcast listener, please continue to be a podcast listener, because this is not the last time that we're going to be touching on what is clearly a very needed topic to be talking about.
Absolutely. And just to kind of refresh you, if this is a brand new episode you're listening to, if you're a new listener, please go back and listen to some of these talking about intuition, the ones that lead up to today. But just to kind of encapsulate what intuition is, we're not talking about like women's intuition or anything in a spiritual term. We're actually talking about in a personality type term. Carl Jung came up with this concept of intuitive learning, people who use intuition to learn information. And it's contrasted by people who use their senses to learn information. So people who use intuition are more comfortable with not having to rely upon verifiable sensory information to learn information. And they're open to speculative conversation, they're open to speculation, they're open to looking for what's behind the curtain or connecting the dots when those dots aren't naturally connected.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about. People who have a personality type that has a preference for using this as their primary way of learning information.
Right, and it ends up informing things like what they're interested in, what kinds of conversations juice them up. It touches on a lot of different aspects of their life. So if this is the first podcast you've listened to, please go back and listen to the podcast on what is intuition. And then the two different styles of intuition, which is the following podcast in the series, extroverted intuition versus introverted intuition. But in this particular podcast, we wanted to, as Joel mentioned, tie it all together. We want to talk about some of the most important components that an intuitive can introduce to their life, or at least have high awareness of, in order to be at their happiest. Because that's kind of the point. The point is that, I'm an intuitive, nobody understands me, I've grown up being misunderstood, and now I'm depressed, or now I don't have the quality of life I want, or now I'm not reaching out for the big game that I want to reach out for, or whatever your personal glass ceiling is.
Yeah.
Whatever glass ceiling has been created for you, or you created yourself, or however that went down. Here are some of what we think are the highest leverage things to keep in mind in order to bust through that glass ceiling.
And a simple framework, just for the sake of this podcast, to look at this through, like a lens to look at this through, is you and your intuition and other people, your friends and family and the people in your sphere or the strangers you run into, and then you and your intuition and what you're going to be doing in the world with that. So kind of your mission, your purpose, your passion, whatever it is that manifests itself out. It's just a simple framework of 3 different parts we can look at as we kind of unpack some of this and work through how your intuition impacts every part of your life. So let's start off by focusing in on the personal level. You and your intuition and how it impacts you as a person.
Well, I would say that the first thing that an intuitive should be doing in order to be able to have the healthiest relationship with their intuition is to be healthy themselves. Like, I mean, that's pretty much like the first starting point for anybody in any context. Try to become the healthiest version of yourself that you possibly can be. Now, just like, who is it? Tolstoy wrote Anna Karenina. And he said that every happy family is the same, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way.
Yeah.
So health looks one way, and being unhealthy looks like a million different ways. So there's a million different ways to not be healthy. And when it comes to intuitives, usually the thing that's keeping them from being healthy is their lack of self-permission and self-acceptance. That's generally where it starts. And so if you want to have the best relationship, if you basically want to be happy, I mean, we're talking about, the best relationship with your intuition, etc. But it really comes down to, if you want to be happy and like take advantage of this life and have the highest quality life that you can, the first thing that you can do is become personally healthy. And as an intuitive, that means starting out with self-acceptance. That's like your baseline. Your baseline is going, okay, so this thing makes me different than others. And that's not a good or a bad thing. It just is, right? I'm just going to accept this as what is, and I don't have to judge it, right? Because a lot of times we're judging it as wrong, or we believe other people have judged it as wrong. Well, just accepting it as a fact is pretty much like the first foundation point. It's like, okay, I'm intuitive. All right, so I don't have to see that as good or bad. It just is. And when you accept your status as an intuitive, then it becomes about learning how to navigate the world and manage that intuitive component. And so if you're not accepting it and you're not managing it, then it can be seen in a negative light because, you're out of energy, you're not fitting in with everybody else. In that case, it is negative to be intuitive. However, if you're accepting it and you're managing your energy as an intuitive, understanding this component, now it's a positive. In fact, it can be outrageously amazing to be an intuitive when you're doing it well. So self-acceptance is the first point of being personally healthy. And then on top of that, as an intuitive, managing your energy as an intuitive, which looks slightly different.
Yeah. I would also say that when we talked about this in the second part of the series, is really understanding, because there are two types of intuition. So as you as a person, understanding the difference between one type of intuition and the other, and which one you have, because it will manifest itself a little bit differently. I know we're getting a little bit more specific when I say that, but it is important because how your intuition comes up for you and how you're going to play with it is going to be much different, whether it's introverted intuition or extroverted intuition, how you embody that and how you allow that to come up in your life. So I think that's another part of this. Part of that permission is not only giving yourself permission to be intuitive in general, but give yourself permission to be intuitive in the specific way that you're intuitive.
Right, exactly. So that also feeds into that concept of managing your energy as well. You're going to manage your energy a little bit differently if you have extroverted intuition than you would manage if you have introverted intuition. And so recognizing that your energy management as an intuitive is a little different than everybody else. And then depending upon your specific kind of intuition, it's going to be a little different from each other. However, just as sort of a gross overview of managing energy, like I keep mentioning, what am I talking about managing energy? Just sort of as a gross overview is that if you are left-handed, using the illustration of left-handed versus right-handed person, which is something we referenced in an earlier podcast, if you're a left-handed person and you just naturally reach for everything with your left hand, but you come in contact with things that are right hand specific, like scissors, then you usually become slightly ambidextrous, or to some extent ambidextrous, so you can use those right-handed scissors. But there's always going to be sort of this sloppy energy, sort of, you're using way more energy than say a right-handed person would, right? There's going to be this sort of casualty of energy expended when you're trying to use these right-handed scissors because it doesn't come naturally to you. It's not your natural flow state to use right-handed scissors if you're a left-handed person. So as an intuitive, if you find yourself doing everything based on the status quo and it's not natural to you to think like that, to talk like that, to go for those kinds of jobs, to whatever it is that, whatever you're doing in life that is feeling slightly unnatural to you as an intuitive, again, you're losing energy in that transaction, right? Like it's sloppy energy transaction, and you don't even think about it because this is just your natural state. Whereas if you're doing things in your flow state, just like if you're a left-handed person and you get a pair of left-handed scissors, like the difference is huge. It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And so now there's more precision. There's not as much energy being used in just trying to like sort of get your brain to wrap around the fact that you're using this thing in the wrong hand, right? Everything just flows, and you've got a lot more like sort of tight energy expenditure right there. And that's what we mean by an intuitive becoming higher levels of health by maintaining that energy, by making sure that they're doing things that feel natural to them, going about things, just mundane everyday things, going about it more naturally to them so that they don't have all this energy lost in the transaction. And so they're not, I mean, you know what it feels like when you're sleep deprived, right? Like it's really hard to be healthy when you're sleep deprived. Somebody says something when you're sleep deprived and you're super sensitive and you snap at them and you're like, everything just feels wrong and off. You get enough sleep, though, and you feel great, right? Like, you don't take things personally, you laugh things off, it's no big deal. So it's the same thing. If you're constantly trying to fight how much energy you're expending to just do basic, mundane, everyday things, it's going to be hard to be healthy because you're constantly fatigued, right? You're fatigued in a way that you can't point to. It's not exhausted from lack of sleep. It's not exhausted from eating the wrong foods. It's exhausted because you're putting 3 times as much energy for a third of the return just because you're constantly working in a way that doesn't feel natural to you.
Yeah. And, we've talked about this also in previous podcasts. The world is not set up for you. It's about a 75-25 split where 25% of the population thinks like you, isn't intuitive, has this way of learning, and the rest of the world, similar to being left-handed in a right-handed world, you have to make your way in a world that's not set up for you. So there is going to be a lot of energy expansion, is that a word? I don't even know. Expending energy that is not, it's not something that is naturally there to accommodate for you. And so you'll have to spend some extra energy. And I think what Antonia is really saying is, be cautious. Like look at the world that you're in, and if there's ways that you can conserve some of that energy by not having to deal with certain things or expending energy in certain ways, I think that can be helpful to you as an intuitive.
Yeah, so I think we're talking in some pretty high abstraction. So I'm trying to think of a really good concrete example, and one of the best ways that I can think of it is small talk.
Yeah.
Like, and some intuitives are better than others at small talk. Small talk for some intuitives can be incredibly fatiguing. Like it's so energy inefficient for some intuitives to speak in small talk. Others are okay at it. They just kind of understand that this is sort of par for the course socially.
Yeah.
But for others, it makes them want to seriously stab their faces. And so if you're a person who doesn't engage very well in small talk, but you believe that is the currency of people, and so you have to engage in small talk, ask yourself if you don't have to anymore. Ask yourself if it would be totally okay if you just didn't engage in small talk. I got to a point where I just stopped talking in small talk. I just don't do it anymore. I'll do it for maybe 2 seconds and then I'm done. And I've given myself permission to dive directly into what is an interesting topic for me next. Like if I'm talking to somebody who's, I've never met before, I'm like, oh, hey, so, and then they mention the weather and I'll talk about the weather for 2 seconds. And then I immediately ask them something that's interesting to me. So you said that you're from, I don't know, I just went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So you said you're from Gettysburg. So, and then I'll ask them a question that's interesting to me. What's it like to be surrounded by tourists 24/7, right? And so that's interesting to me. It's still a relatively safe, subject of conversation, but it's not as boring as the weather for the last, what the Farmer's Almanac says the weather's supposed to be like this winter. That couldn't be less interesting to me. Certainly. So I've given myself full permission. Now, granted, not everybody wants to go there with me, so I don't always get conversational return, right? Yeah. I don't always have an interesting conversation with that person and sometimes it ends up awkward. But I'd much rather an awkward weirdness for 30 seconds and then just separate than to spend the next 10 minutes talking small talk.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that 30 seconds of awkward, I'll totally take that hit as opposed to 10 minutes of blow my brains out small talk.
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about. If it's not natural to you, ask yourself if you're doing this for others and the return is not that high. It's not like hitting that 80-20 rule. It's not like something you can give that's small that you get a big return on. If it's just misery all the way around, stop doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also the other thing is something that I would call intuition building ritual or something. I don't know how I'd couch it specifically in word terms, but it's this idea of, I just said you're going to go through life and you have to interact in the real world, and you can't always have intuitive conversation. You're going to have to talk to people in small talk or have to do things that don't feel supernatural to your intuition. So you need to have time set aside every day to where you're building into your intuition, whether it's through reading or talking to a friend on the phone. Maybe you don't live near, but they're an intuitive and you can have a great intuitive conversation, or you're somehow getting that need fed every day. Even a little small ways can make a huge impact. And if it goes too many days without that being fed, you're going to start dying inside. You're going to feel like, oh man, I'm giving so much and I'm getting nothing feeding back into me. I feel like I'm hollow and I'm worn down and I'm sad and I feel depressed and discouraged. And so that's really critical. And it could be 5 to 10 minutes a day. It could really help keep you sharp and keep you built up, feeling like you've got that energy management that you're talking about, Antonia. And I think that's really key.
Yeah. So if you can start to think of your intuition as not something that's broken or something that makes you better than others or anywhere in like a value judgment statement, but simply something that you have that's unique, that requires you to see your own personal energy in a slightly different way than other people do, and you start treating it as something that requires different things to get the same amount of energy and different behaviors that will either conserve or, maybe even generate energy for you, then that's a great model of looking at it. Like, it's a great way to see it as just like, I use energy different than other people, so I've got to keep that top of mind.
Yeah. So the first exercise I'd recommend in this podcast is quickly just take a piece of paper and write down the 5 things that really give you energy as an intuitive. What are the 5 things? And they may not be things you can do every day, but what are those 5 things? Like for me and you, Antonia, conversation is probably number 1 on our list.
Yeah.
If we get in a great intuitive conversation, even for 15 or 30 minutes, we feel like we're walking on clouds for hours afterward. It just juices us up. So make a quick list. What are some things that build into you? Is it reading? Is it talking to somebody? Is it spending some time meditating? What is it that builds into your intuition?
Walking in nature.
Exactly.
Exploring a new, like every time we see a dirt road, every time we drive by a dirt road, I can see Joel's like neck craning to try to figure out what is at the end of that dirt road. And so, doing things like just driving to a section of town that you've never been at to just figure out what's in that section of town, that could be something that fuels your intuition. So it could be mundane little things. It could be not like these huge epic, but it could be everyday actions you can take that will give you your intuition energy. And conversely, I don't know if you feel like this is too much for a single exercise, so let me know if it is, Joel, and you can say, no, don't do that at all. Don't listen to her. But I would also write 5 things that you've noticed sap your energy the most.
Oh, yeah.
Like for me, small talk, right? I need intuitive conversation to give me energy, and small talk feels like somebody is vampirically hanging onto my neck with their teeth and sucking the lifeblood out of me when I have to do it. So it's one of those that I just decided to stop, right? And again, sometimes it makes life a little awkward, and I'm totally okay with that.
Yeah.
Like, I'd much rather have the awkwardness, because for some reason the awkwardness doesn't take as much energy from me as the small talk does. And so figure out what your intuitive energy saps are as well, and ask yourself, do I really, really have to engage in them?
Yeah. And for me, like, not feeling like I have any option to explore my intuition during a day. Like, if I've got everything scheduled through an entire day to the point where it's like back-to-back meetings or back-to-back events or back-to-back phone calls, whatever that is, and I'm producing and creating so much, I don't have any time to be like, you know what, I'm going to take 30 minutes just to read this quick little blog post on something. If I don't feel like I've got that freedom or sovereignty over my life in a day, that starts to make me feel like it's sapping my intuitive energy, because I need that a little bit of wiggle room every day, just a little bit of shifting time to be able to explore something that might just pop up in the middle of my day that I wasn't planning on, that I'm like, I can shift this meeting for 30 minutes, or I can shift this project for 30 minutes just to engage in this one activity that will feed into me. So that's one of my things that hinders me in some things.
I've heard people say things like my entire job like saps my energy as an intuitive. And I know that if we're saying this and it's something like your job, or God forbid your marriage, or the family that you live, you know, your parents or whatever, like some infrastructural piece of your life where you really cannot imagine like being able to change it.
Yeah.
Baby steps. Because the truth is that you probably will have to change it in some way. That doesn't mean you have to quit your job necessarily, but is there any way that you can redefine your position there? And if not, maybe you do have to quit your job at some point and find something new. If it's your marriage, it doesn't mean you have to divorce your mate, but is there any way that you can have a conversation with them that says, hey, look, I've got these needs going unmet and we're going to have to address this? If it's family members, is there any way that you can have a conversation with them? Very similar. So when we're talking about huge infrastructural pieces where you're like, yeah, that's the thing that's sapping my intuitive energy, if to just throw your hands up and go, well, that's how it is, right, is kind of like going, okay, so I have like 70, 80, maybe 90 years on the planet, and I'm going to go ahead and just waste decades of them because I'm not really sure how I'm going to be able to say find another job in this economy. It's like, well, yeah, and find another job in this economy. Like, if there's something that's killing your intuition, we don't have a lot of time on this planet. We really don't. And to waste time going, that's the way it is, I guess I'll just close in on myself and, you know, roll over. We really want to encourage people to see things radically differently. Yeah. Like, you are empowered to change your life, to get your intuitive needs met. You are empowered to do that. And if it seems too big right now to make those huge changes, it's probably because it is too big right now. But if you take baby steps and you make sure you slowly get these intuitive needs met, you do it in like little leverage points throughout the day. Like we said, 5 little things you can do during the day to juice yourself and get that energy going, and 5 little things you can remove that are like the biggest, energy saps. Over time, as you scale up and do more and more and more to honor that intuitive space, you will eventually become ready. Yeah. You will get to a point where you are ready to make the big changes in order to honor your intuition. And it might not feel like it right now, but that's because it isn't ready right now, but it will be. Yeah.
So that's basically you and your intuition personally, how you're going to have a relationship with your intuition. And we gave you some interesting tips and some things. Try them. Let us know kind of how those work. Let's talk a little bit about you and the people around you. So now we're talking about you and your intuition, and now the world you have to interact with, the friends, the family, the coworkers, your spouse or lover, your children, all the different people that move in and out of your life on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. As an intuitive, how do you make yourself, how do you make your way in this world? And how do you navigate this space when, again, 75% of the people you run into are not going to think and learn information in the same way that you do? So how do you make your way in this world?
Yeah. So when it comes to your relationship with other people, just like the foundation of your own personal health comes down to self-acceptance, right? Acknowledging the reality of the situation and not resisting it, or not trying to aggrandize it, but just going, okay, so that's what is. The same can be said about the foundation of your relationship with other people. It's accepting them as they are as well. So one of the big, just the big biases that come out of this awakening, and it's almost like you can't help it. One of the first things I see intuitives do is that as soon as they recognize who they are and what batch of people they share an intuitive preference with, right? They discover like all these major leaders in the world have been intuitive and all these great people are intuitive. Because it's usually a response to them having felt less than before. It's really easy to let the pendulum swing over into, oh, I'm actually better than.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm exclusive. I'm part of this 25%. All these world leaders have come out of the 25%. I'm built for bigger, better things. And so, therefore, I must be better as a human being.
Yeah.
And that actually doesn't, it actually doesn't even matter whether or not that's true, because I don't know if that's true or not. But it doesn't increase your personal happiness. Because then suddenly you're like, well, I'm the one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind. I'm surrounded by fools, right? Well, how is that going to help increase your personal happiness?
Yeah. Well, and we've seen people that we know who have literally awakened to their intuition in some ways, and they've said, okay, well, now I'm actually better than having to work a regular job, to the point where they're unwilling to take a regular job, even though it would provide food for them or people that they love, and they're kind of just floating through life saying, I don't feel like I want to stoop to the level of having to enter the real world and live a real life.
Yeah.
I don't think we're talking about that extreme. We're talking about reaching out your intuition and thinking of things in radically different ways. That's cool if you want to go down that path. That's a tough road to go.
Yeah.
And my recommendation is not to go the route of I'm better than, and that means I'm above having to do anything that I don't like to do.
Yeah.
But instead say, hey, I'm just different. I'm not better than. I just think differently. And yeah, there is some maybe leadership qualities or some things that I might think about different that might lead me to some other opportunities that maybe some other people don't have. But again, that doesn't make me better or above having to do basic things in life.
Yeah. Actually, we rewatched the movie Good Will Hunting.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that in that movie, this like complete and utter mathematical genius, and he just is naturally gifted with math on a level where like he doesn't have any qualifications. He was a janitor in a university, and now he's got some of the biggest corporations and think tanks in the world vying for his attention. And he didn't want any of those jobs because I think he was afraid that he thought he'd become better than, like he would see himself as better than. And what you're talking about is sort of the reverse of that, is assuming you're better than, and so therefore you are above menial jobs, whereas he didn't want to appear better than, and so he kept the menial jobs, or that's where he sort of kept himself at.
Both are pretty extreme.
Well, and they're both under the same fallacy, which is that your job defined you. Mm-hmm. Right? Like somehow whatever position or job you're doing, like that somehow indicates whether or not you're a humble or a proud person. And that's not how reality works. In fact, eventually, like after many conversations from multiple people, he finally came to the understanding that he should take these positions with these think tanks, not because it will, being a janitor is somehow less than, but that these think tank positions need people who have special abilities, and he is one of them. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that it was, he was too good to be a janitor. It's that he had qualifications that most people don't have, and the world needs those qualifications for these positions. So as an intuitive, it's very similar. It's not like some, cubicle job, you're above that and you shouldn't have to do that. Or even a janitor's job. Let's take the Good Will Hunting example. It's not that you're necessarily above any of this, right? It's that you might have very unique abilities that the world needs in other capacities.
Yeah. Right?
It's not better than or less than. And so starting to see things as like, well, I'm too good for a day job. Like that's not the position you want to take. It's more like, what need is going unmet in the world that I'm uniquely positioned to be able to fill?
Yeah.
And because intuitives generally want to make an impact in the world, because that's a desire of theirs, then it creates a win-win. The world needs this. I'm uniquely positioned to provide it. And also, I want to be playing a bigger game. So look, it's a win-win-win all the way around.
Yeah.
Whereas staying in a more, like in a job that has less meaning attached to it, and of course, there's cubicle jobs that have a lot of meaning attached to them, right? There's plenty of nonprofits out there. People can be working cubicle jobs and have tons of meaning in their job. So it's not to indicate that a cubicle job automatically means you're not making a difference in the world. It's just sort of it's a stereotype. But that said, I think cubicle job is sort of like the next incarnation of working on a factory belt, of which we generally don't do anymore because robots are doing that. Yeah. So it's sort of the next incarnation. But that said, it's not as if you're too good for any of this. And it's not as if you were doing it, you'd have automatically thrown up your hands and given up. It's more that there are big game challenges in the world that need big game thinking. right? They need big thinking. And intuitives are generally the ones who are thinking in this way. So is there any way that you can start to craft and manufacture and sort of strategize your life to get yourself pointed in one of those directions, right?
Yeah.
Like you could keep the basic job right now as you start to think, I really want to do, and then fill in the blank with whatever mission you want to accomplish in the world. So how do I start to head that direction?
Yeah. So this word permission, you mentioned this word permission in the first part, talking about you and your intuition, and then your intuition and other people around you, and you use permission again, keeps coming up basically. And you said one of the things that, understanding you're an intuitive and giving yourself permission to be an intuitive allows you to give everybody permission to be whoever they are, whether they learn with a sensory learning style, intuition learning style, whether they have a career that you have no interest in and they have a career that you'd love to have and die for. But whatever it is, you give them permission. And I think there's a little bit of a challenge here and I think this is not going to be new to you as you're listening to this, that just because you give people permission to be who they are does not mean that they're going to give you permission to be who you are. Again, remember, when we're talking about intuition and yourself, we're talking about giving yourself self-permission, self-sovereignty over your life. And really, that's the only place it's going to come from for you as an intuitive is from within. You're the only person that can give you permission to be your true, authentic, accurate self. And remember that other people are still, even in the midst of this, going to look at you like, man, you are a weirdo, or you are thinking so different, or you're so intelligent. They're going to have all these labels or categories for you based on your intuition. And just because you give permission from your end to other people doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily give permission. And it's not because they're being jerks or anything. They just maybe don't have this ability right now, but they're not going to be giving you permission back in your direction to be that intuitive self, that intuitive person that you know deep in your heart, your soul, and your mind that you are.
Right. And so I think that that's why it's so important to build appreciation for people who are not intuitive. I mean, as we were just mentioning, they're not necessarily going to return the favor. And so that's another reason why intuitives have a tendency to get this attitude that they're better than, because people are not necessarily holding space for them. But that's not relevant. It's not really about fairness. It's not really about whether or not other people are giving back to you what you're giving to them. It's fundamentally, ultimately about happiness. And thinking you're better than other people, not gaining appreciation for the sensory style of learning is one of the biggest things that leads to people feeling like the universe is against them. And you pack up resentment inside of yourself if you don't give them space to be them, even if being them includes them never understanding you. If you don't give them that space, then every little bump and bruise that comes from that direction is going to be a new irritant. And you're never going to really achieve happiness at that point. So it's not really about returning the favor. It's more about, okay, so what do I need to be a healthy person? What do I need to be healthy in healthy relationships with other people? And building appreciation for the sensory learning style, building appreciation for what they give to the world is a big piece of that.
And the real challenge here is when you're married to somebody, or you're in a romantic relationship with someone, or your children have a sensory learning style. These people who are very close to you in your life that don't think the way you do, that's where I think the challenge really lies in bridging this gap. And as an intuitive, you're bilingual. You have probably built some skill in speaking in sensory ways because you've had to make yourself your way in the world. We talked about intuitive blending a couple episodes ago, and this idea that you've probably built skill and you've probably blended to some degree, so you have some skill in this, and you're very equipped to be able to talk about things. And there's an opportunity for you to explain to the people in your life who love you and you love that your brain learns information a different way, and you got to go about it in a careful way that you don't come across superior or like better than, like we've been talking about. But there is a way to say, hey, listen, here's how if you can understand this, here's how my brain learns and understands information, and these are some of the things I need in my life. And is there a way we can co-create some of this? And also, hey, are there some needs that are going unmet in your life, whatever those are? Now, that's maybe a spouse or a lover. Maybe you have a child who you can't sit down and have that conversation with right now, but you can hold space like Antonia's talking about until that moment can come to have that conversation. I mean, I have a child, my middle child, who's about 6 years old at the time of this recording. He uses a sensory learning style. He doesn't use intuition. And so I try to take time for him specifically to cater to his needs in that way, because the rest of us in the household do have an intuitive learning style. So I relate to him in a little bit different way, and I spend some time doing some sensory things with him. I try to give him assurance and verifiability. Now, we're an intuitive household. You might be the only intuitive in your house or your sphere of influence. So it's a little different from my perspective here. But let's say you have a sensory child or a spouse who uses a sensory process. There's ways to hold space. There's ways to communicate. So think about these. Maybe take a few moments here. This is an exercise you can do here. And think about the ways that you can communicate your intuition. Think about the ways you can hold space. And think about the ways you can relate to them on their terms if they don't think like you do.
Yeah. And again, even if you never get the favor returned, it's not about balancing the scales of justice.
Exactly.
It's about learning behaviors that will lead to your happiness and making space for people who are different, not using this information immediately to go, oh, I knew I was better the whole time, or I knew that I was superior. Using this information to go, okay, so this is how I am, and this is how they are. And because this is how I am, I'm probably going to be able to get how they are better than they're going to be able to get how I am. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to have to live with that. I'm just going to have to figure that out. One of the best ways to do that, though, is to make sure that you are building relationships with other intuitives. Now, it doesn't have to be a spouse relationship. It doesn't have to be, usually oftentimes these people will become close, you'll become closer to them than to other people. But however that ends up looking, make sure that you are in relationships with other intuitives. Make sure you're getting that intuitive conversation. Make sure that you're getting that energy sort of cross-pollination and those what-if conversations that are so important to keep the intuitive mind honed, right, sharp. The intuitive conversation, it's sharpening the axe. And so it's very important that it's represented somewhere in your life. And if you want to know how to create a tribe, how to build relationships, we actually did a podcast on building a tribe in the past. So go reference that for tips and strategies on how to create those relationships and build a tribe.
Well, and quite frankly, this is all we're hitting the surface of some plans for you and some action steps that you can take immediately, because we want you to be able to step forward in your intuition and be actionable on this. And again, if you really want to dive deep, we have an entire program called Intuitive Awakening around this, where we really go in depth on how to build a tribe, how to relate to other people using your intuition, all that stuff. So, check out Intuitive Awakening if you want to really go deep with this and get some really specific exercises and some action plans around some of this. So we've talked about you and your intuition, giving yourself permission to be an intuitive. We've talked about, the ways you can really embody that as a person. We've then talked about extending that out to the people around you, your friends, your family, your children, your spouse, your lover, coworkers, people around you. And now let's talk a little bit about, you're an intuitive. You've embraced this. You've learned some strategies, and you've gone through the steps to really begin to relate to people, embodying your intuition. What is the next step? How are you going to now live your life differently? One of our famous mentors always says, true learning equals behavior change. So what is the behavior change? How are you going to live your life now moving forward with this new awareness that you're intuitive? And how are you going to look at your passion, your purpose, and your mission going forward in life? And I think we can talk about this for a few minutes here and give you some action steps and some ideas on this too.
Yeah, I think it's good, though, to mention what you just said. Now that you've got a healthy relationship with yourself, now that you've established healthy relationships with other people, how do you extend your greatest gifts out to the world? That's exactly how it works. In order to really have healthy relationships with other people, you have to have a healthy relationship with yourself. And in order to give the world your greatest gifts as an intuitive, then you have to be getting those lower needs met. Not lower as in undignified, but as in foundational needs. You need to be getting those foundational needs met, which is relationships, which is making sure that you're showing up in a healthy way. And then once you've figured out the formulas for those, and now that you're full, and by full I mean like you've got your needs met, you are coming from a place of abundance, not from a place of scarcity, then you can turn your gifts to the world at large. And that is generally a matter of, you just use those three phrases, passion, purpose, mission. That is generally figuring out, what are you here to do as an intuitive? One of my favorite questions I learned from a friend of mine who said, what is the world forgotten that you're here to remind it of? And I like to add an extension to that question, which is, what did the world never know that you're here to teach it? So figuring out what you're here to remind the world of, or to teach brand new for the first time, is oftentimes very much in alignment with whether, what direction an intuitive is going to go now that they're ready and primed and in a position to share their intuitive gifts with the world.
Yeah, and we're going to go into probably an entire series on finding your purpose, your mission in life, and we're going to really get into in-depth and unpack this in future episodes and future trainings and things of this nature. But today we're really going to hone in on that part of you that's intuitive and how that shows up. And I think really, the first iteration of this for you as an intuitive, at least for me in my journey, and I think maybe for you, Antonia, too, I'm not exactly sure your specific journey in this was, okay, now I know I'm an intuitive, and now I know that I'm going to relate to other people as an intuitive. What are those things that I've always kind of left just off to the side because I never thought that I could fully embody them? Just that initial, like, oh, I want to do that because that appeals to my intuition. And now that I have permission to be an intuitive and relate to people in an intuitive way, give myself permission to be able to move into some of those very basic things. It's not necessarily world-shattering, audacious goals per se, but what are some of those first starting points that I can use to be an intuitive, or that I can go after as an intuitive? And I think that's really probably a great starting point to get people used to this, because it's going to feel weird at first to go down this road and maybe exercise some of that. So you might want to start small and not try to go after, I'm going to solve world hunger right out of the gate, but something little at first.
Yeah, well, and I think that's why there's a progression of passion, purpose, and mission. We define those a little differently. When I see somebody who's in a passion business, or they're doing what they're passionate about, it's something that really means something to them, but it's not necessarily a world changer. I mean, you can be passionate about, like shower curtain rods. Like, that could be the thing you're passionate about, and you just want to go and be a shower curtain rod salesman, and that's the thing that just juices you up. And that's a passion, and that's usually the starting point for a lot of people. They start out with something that they're passionate about. Then once they've gotten to a point where they've given themselves permission to make a living doing the thing they love, then oftentimes it graduates to purpose, which is, okay, how do I do what I love and then also impact the world in a positive way? And that's usually when people start thinking in things in terms of purpose. And then eventually, and there's a smaller segment of the population that's actually reached this point, but I've seen that eventually when people go through that level of purpose, they get to mission. Mission's a little different than purpose. Purpose is like, how do I impact the world in a positive way? Mission is like, okay, now I know why I'm here, and I'm going to start a movement, right? I'm going to be the light bearer. I'm going to be somebody that other people look up to as the person who will be at the forefront of this movement.
Yeah.
And it's attaining basically thought leader status, or basically getting up to the point of not just doing what you love, or not just wanting to impact the world in a positive way, but like, you're like, now Joan of Arc will die for a cause. Like, you are on mission.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes when we think, oh gosh, I have to play a bigger game, we're envisioning us being on mission. But we don't start out there. We start out usually just giving ourselves permission to do the thing we're passionate about. Just giving ourselves permission to do a job that we love. That alone can be difficult, right? That alone can be like a big step for people if they feel like they've been forced to they've been forced to live a life where they just work hard, and that's noble, right? It's just noble to work hard even if you hate your job. So getting to the point of doing something you're passionate about can sometimes be a massive scale-up moment for somebody. And then purpose is a scale-up from passion, and mission is a scale-up from purpose.
Yeah. So, and again, we oftentimes get templates handed to us of what is important and what we should care about. And I think one of the things for me, for my personal intuitive awakening experience, was having a moment of realization that the quote-unquote purpose and missions that I was really embodying at the time when that awakening happened were not my purpose and missions. They were not my passions. They were some that I was told I should have. And that might be anything in your life. I don't know whether it's religion or education or the quality of life you have or the way you're going to career, whatever it is for you that you've been given from your parents or the culture you grew up in. Oftentimes, it's very different than what's truly in your heart and mind. And that awakening experience and you seeing, oh, again, we use this word permission. You have permission to be yourself as an intuitive. You have permission to show up in the world and be present as an intuitive around other people. And then you have permission to really ask yourself the question, is what I've been given for the passion, purpose, and mission in my life, or at least the inklings of that, is that really me? Or do I have permission to look into myself and say, this isn't what I wanted at all. I actually want to go out a totally different road than what I've been given. And now that I'm starting to give myself permission, this is why it builds upon itself. It's foundational, like Antonia said. It starts to build on itself and you get more and more permission. And by the time you get to this level, you're starting to question and say, is this what I actually want to bring to the world and show up with? And opening up that question in your mind and your heart, I believe, is very powerful. And giving yourself that permission to speculate and to say, okay, where am I going to show up in the world? Not just what I've been told I should show up as.
Yeah, absolutely. I just to give myself and my story as a part of this, I think sometimes it can just be a suggestion that's possible.
Yeah.
I went to school to become a radiologist, right? Like I took a bunch of anatomy physiology courses and that's the direction I was going to go. And it wasn't because I wanted to. In fact, I hated it. And so then I just bumbled around for, after school, I bumbled around for a lot of years. I never really settled on any sort of career. I was going to do volunteer work as my career. And when I graduated from that time period in my life, I remember being at a leadership conference and I was talking to somebody who was in internet marketing. And I was talking to him about personality types because it was sort of, I don't know, it was a subject that was of interest at that particular seminar. And, I was always interested in them. I had been interested in them for like 15 years. I had gleaned a ton of information. And I was just talking to this internet marketer about what I knew. And he looked at me, he just kind of stopped me mid-sentence. He goes, do you sell this online? And I'm like, no, this is just interesting. He goes, because you're marketable. And that's all it took. It was the first little insinuation in my mind that I could actually be talking about and teaching the subject that I loved.
Yeah.
Like it was the first time that it had ever been introduced to me.
Well, and not only you had built mastery around this to a degree where you're very good at what you did at the time, but you hadn't really you didn't think about it as like a viable business or a career for you. You just had mastery in this because you cared and you liked it a lot. Because
I loved it. It was the idea I was making love to. And I'll tell you something though, having to teach it to other people, turning it into an actual business has increased my proficiency tenfold. Like I never had a level of mastery around it like I do now, because now I'm in the hot seat all the time. Now I've got to know what I'm talking about. Now I have to make sure that I can not only talk about it, but break it down in a way that other people can understand it and then help them replicate the same results. So it's definitely turned my proficiency. It just dialed it up to 10. That said, though, all it took was a seed. And sometimes that's all an intuitive needs is an insinuation or just a little phrase that sort of knocks something loose inside that goes, you could do this. And I had never thought of that. I'm like, what do you mean I can do this? What would that look like? And that sent me off on an entirely, seriously, it was a 90-degree angle. Right? Like I was heading this one direction and this insinuation came and then suddenly I am in a completely different path. And I think that that's one of the major things that I want to do with these podcasts, with the Intuitive Awakening trainings, with the blog posts, with the Facebook comments. My goal is to use these messages as just that tiny little seed. Like, hey, did you ever think that maybe you could do the thing you love to do? And it was like, oh, I never thought of that. I mean, I seriously had never considered that that was possible. And so I went from I lived in cubicle oceans for a decade, right?
Yeah.
Like I was doing nothing but one cubicle job after another until I heard that. Now, granted, it was not easy. There was tons of investment of time, education, money. I had to figure out what internet marketing meant because I didn't even know that phrase existed at the time. So I had no idea what that could look like. And there were time periods of starving artistry. Like there were time periods in my business where I like made no money and was giving my wares away for free. And it put me on a path that I was doing what I loved. And so all it takes sometimes is an insinuation. So as the listener, as the person who's identifying as an intuitive, as the person who might be hearing us talk about this and go, yeah, but I couldn't do that. Or, yeah, but they don't know my situation, right? Well, yeah, you're right. I don't know your situation. I do know, though, that there's a lot of situations that other intuitives have blazed through that were probably just as difficult, if not more difficult than yours. And it's really not about the reality of how difficult your situation is or whether or not you can do it. It's more about your perception of that reality. It's more about how have you defined the terms of your life? And is there any room? Is there any room to reevaluate? Is there any room to ask, maybe I've been playing a small game, right? Like maybe I could do what I love to do if I just had a little faith in myself. If I just thought, maybe I could go the direction I've always secretly wanted to go, but I never gave myself permission to go that way. What could we knock loose? What is the one little tiny thing in your head that could just kind of open up? Just a little crack, right? Just to get the foot in the door and go, maybe it could look radically different than I've thought about it before, than I've allowed for it to look before. Because that's that reframe, that redirection, that possibilities thinking, that foot in the door is how people get to a point where they're doing things like charity water. Right? That dude, he is making a huge difference in the world, and that wasn't his original path, right? Something got knocked loose in him, and he went, I could go this route. Right? Now, he had built mastery in his PR profession, and he took all of those skills and applied it to his new mission, right? And that's what you could do, whoever you are, whatever you've been building skills up to this point to do, right? And you can reapply them. That's what I do. Like all the skills that I had before, I did a ton of public speaking. I did a ton of, basically cold sales my entire life. And so I was able to take those skills and apply them into the thing that I love now, which you could do as well. But whatever it is that you've been kicking around or maybe haven't allowed yourself to kick around, the direction that you could be going, that's what we want. We want you to just start thinking about it.
Yeah.
What would that look like? What would it look like if I started going the direction that is the desire of my heart?
And I think the thing that I would recommend is don't take it so serious. And we're talking about passion, purpose, and mission, which sounds super serious. But play with this new awareness. Play with this idea. I'm intuitive. I show up to the world, to the people around me as an intuitive. And I can play with some options now of different directions to go to. Don't feel like we were talking to a friend of ours recently, and they're kind of panicked, like they're trying to figure out what their purpose is going to be, and it's like crippling because they feel like once they choose this is going to be for the rest of their lives. And the challenge is don't feel like you've got to figure one thing out. My advice to this person was, just take something that's passionate for you right now and do it. Even if it's part-time or in the evenings or on weekends and still keep your day job, start playing with what that feels like to do something you're passionate about. Start playing with this. You don't have to commit your entire life to it right now. And give yourself, again, that word comes up, permission to begin to play with this new awareness you have. And it can open up all sorts of possibilities of thinking and ways of doing things. And really, really just play. Just get down and get fun like a little kid would in a sense. And let your intuition run wild for a little bit. See what happens. So again, I just want to mention that we have a program that dives deep into intuition called Intuitive Awakening. It's about awakening your intuition. And there's all sorts of action plans and steps. And we dive deep into this topic, which is extremely powerful. And we've had several hundred people go through this program to awaken their intuition, and they've come out with amazing results, amazing feedback. And this is a topic that we're getting a ton of attention for. So it's, I think, a great need. Check it out. It's you can find it at intuitiveawakening.net. And you can read all about the program. You can sign up. You can take the program, and let us know how it's working for you and the other questions you might have. And to do that, come to our website, personalityhacker.com, or you can go to facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack and join the community. Join the community of like-minded intuitives, people who think like you, who are wanting to make a difference, who are embodying their intuition. And we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Well, and one more thing that I was going to actually request of the listener. If you like our podcast, if you're enjoying what you've heard in this series on intuition or any of the other podcasts that we've had on multiple topics, if you could run over to iTunes and give us a little bit of a rating, that would be awesome. Just go, basically let us know how you feel about this particular podcast. It doesn't have to be a good rating, just has to be an honest rating.
Yes, it does. What are you talking about?
We would love a good rating.
If you want to say anything bad, just email us.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. If you want to leave any rating you want to, that's cool.
Yeah, that would be great. We would really appreciate it if you would be willing to go over to iTunes and give us a rating and maybe some feedback on how you feel about this podcast. And of course, we love suggestions. So if you like this series, let us know what you'd like to hear in the future, and we'll do our best to accommodate.
Absolutely. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
You've been listening to the Personality Hacker Podcast. We'll talk to you on the next episode.